What if I told you that right now in this very moment you're not fully alive and not fully dead? That according to ancient Tibetan wisdom, you exist in a perpetual state of transition, suspended between one reality and the next. This isn't just philosophical speculation. This is the profound teaching of the Bardos, a concept so revolutionary that it transforms everything we think we know about life, death, and the nature of consciousness itself. Today, we're going to explore why Tibetan Buddhism teaches that you are always between lives, and how understanding this truth can fundamentally change how you experience every single moment of your existence. If you're ready to discover the hidden architecture of consciousness and unlock the secret to living with complete awareness, then subscribe now and activate notifications, because this journey will challenge everything you thought was real. Here's a paradox that will shatter everything you think you know about Buddhist spirituality. Tibetan Buddhism, a tradition famous for recognizing reincarnated lamas like the Dalai Lama, actually teaches that reincarnation is impossible. In fact, one of the most fundamental principles of Buddhist philosophy is that there is no permanent self that could reincarnate in the first place. This isn't a minor technical distinction. This is a revolutionary understanding that separates Buddhism from virtually every other spiritual tradition on earth. And misunderstanding it means missing the entire point of Buddhist practice. If you're ready to discover why Buddhism's teaching on rebirth is far more profound and liberating than the concept of reincarnation, and how this ancient wisdom challenges modern assumptions about identity and consciousness, then subscribe to this channel right now and activate notifications, because we're about to explore one of the most misunderstood teachings in spiritual history. Walk into any bookstore in the Western world, and you'll find dozens of books about reincarnation that casually mention Buddhism as supporting evidence. Popular culture has created a narrative where Buddhism, Hinduism, and various New Age philosophies all teach essentially the same thing: that you have an eternal soul that lives multiple lifetimes, moving from body to body like someone changing clothes. This narrative is so pervasive that even many practicing Buddhists accept it without question. But this represents one of the most significant misunderstandings of Buddhist philosophy in the modern world. The Buddha didn't teach reincarnation. He explicitly rejected it. What he taught instead was rebirth. And the difference between these two concepts is not semantic hair-splitting. It's the difference between bondage and liberation, between clinging to illusion and recognizing reality. To understand why this matters, we need to examine what reincarnation actually means. The word comes from Latin, re meaning again, and incarnate meaning to make flesh. Reincarnation is the doctrine that a permanent, unchanging soul or self takes birth in successive physical bodies. This soul is your essential identity, your true self, the experiencer of all your experiences. According to reincarnation doctrine, this soul existed before you were born, will continue after you die, and has lived countless previous lives. Your personality, memories, and circumstances may change from life to life, but underneath all these surface changes, there's a continuous self, an essential you that persists through time. This is the teaching of Hinduism, Jainism, and many Western esoteric traditions. It's also what the Buddha called one of the most dangerous delusions that keeps beings trapped in suffering. The historical context is crucial here. When the Buddha began teaching in northern India around the 5th century BCE, the dominant religious framework was Vedic Hinduism, which taught the doctrine of atman and Brahman. Atman is the individual soul or self, understood as eternal, unchanging, and identical in essence with Brahman, the universal absolute reality. The Upanishads, foundational texts of Hindu philosophy, declare Tattvamasi, meaning, thou art that, indicating that your true self is actually the cosmic self, temporarily appearing to be individual due to ignorance. Liberation in this framework means realizing your identity with Brahman, recognizing that your individual soul was never truly separate from the universal soul. This is a monistic philosophy. Ultimately, all is one, and that one is eternal, unchanging, and absolute. The Buddha's teaching emerged as a direct challenge to this worldview. In what would become one of the most distinctive and radical aspects of Buddhist philosophy, he taught anatman, or anatta, meaning no self or non-self. This is not a denial that you exist in conventional terms. It's a precise analysis of what you actually are versus what you imagine yourself to be. When you examine your experience carefully, the Buddha taught, you cannot find anything that qualifies as a permanent, unchanging, independent self. What you find instead is a dynamic, interdependent process, a flowing stream of physical and mental phenomena that arise and pass away in dependence on causes and conditions. There's no owner of these experiences, no experiencer separate from the experiencing, no eternal witness watching the show. There's just the show itself, appearing and disappearing moment by moment. The Buddha analyzed human existence in terms of 5 aggregates or heaps, called skandhas in Sanskrit and khandhas in Pali. These 5 aggregates are form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. Let's examine each one carefully, because understanding these aggregates is the key to understanding why there's no permanent self that could reincarnate. Form refers to the physical body and material reality, everything composed of the 4 elements: earth, water, fire, and air. Your body is form. It's constantly changing, never the same from one moment to the next. Cells die and regenerate, molecules exchange with the environment, energy flows through organic processes. Can this body be your permanent self? Obviously not, because it changes continuously and eventually dies completely. Even within a single lifetime, your body transforms dramatically from infancy through old age. If your body were yourself, which body would be the real you? The body you had at age 5, age 25, age 70, they're all different bodies. So form cannot be the permanent self that reincarnates. Feeling refers not to emotions but to the basic quality of experience as pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Every moment of consciousness has a feeling tone. When you eat something delicious, pleasant feeling arises. When you touch something hot, unpleasant feeling arises. When you're simply sitting quietly, neutral feeling predominates. But feelings are obviously impermanent. Pleasant feelings don't last, which is precisely why we suffer when they end. Unpleasant feelings also pass, which is why we can endure them. Can these constantly changing feelings be your permanent self? No, because they arise and cease in response to conditions. You don't own your feelings. They simply occur as part of the ongoing stream of experience. Perception is the function that recognizes and labels experience, that identifies this as a tree, that as a person, this sound as music, that smell as coffee. Perception allows you to navigate the world by categorizing the raw data of sensation. But perception is clearly conditioned by culture, language, and personal history. Someone from a tropical climate perceives snow differently than someone from the Arctic. An expert botanist perceives distinctions in plants that escape ordinary notice. Your perceptions change as you learn and as your brain develops or degrades. Perception cannot be the permanent self, because it's obviously shaped by impermanent conditions and changes throughout life. Mental formations is a broad category that includes intentions, emotions, habits, desires, aversions, beliefs, and all the various mental factors that color consciousness. This aggregate includes everything from momentary impulses to deep-seated character traits. But all mental formations are conditioned phenomena. They arise based on previous experiences, genetic predispositions, environmental influences, and countless other factors. Your intentions today differ from your intentions yesterday. Your emotions flow and change. Even seemingly stable personality traits evolve over decades. What you wanted desperately at age 15 might seem absurd at age 50. Can these constantly changing mental formations be your permanent self? No, because they're obviously products of causes and conditions, not eternal essences. Consciousness is the knowing function, the basic awareness that allows the other aggregates to be experienced. There's visual consciousness when seeing occurs, auditory consciousness when hearing occurs, mental consciousness when thinking occurs. Buddhism identifies 6 types of consciousness corresponding to the 5 senses plus mental cognition. But consciousness is not a thing or substance. It's a process that arises when sense organs contact sense objects in the presence of attention. No contact, no consciousness. Consciousness of blue arises when a functioning eye contacts blue light. Consciousness of sound arises when a functioning ear contacts sound waves. When any component is missing, that consciousness doesn't arise. A person blind from birth has no visual consciousness because the conditions for it don't exist. This demonstrates that consciousness is conditioned and dependent, not autonomous and permanent. Even within a single day, your consciousness changes dramatically between waking, dreaming, and deep sleep states. If you enjoyed this analysis, please like this video so more people can discover these profound teachings. So we have these 5 aggregates: form, feeling, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. The Buddha's insight was that everything we call the self is actually just these 5 aggregates functioning together. There's no additional entity, no ghost in the machine, no eternal soul hiding behind or within the aggregates. The aggregates themselves, in their dynamic interaction, are what we mistakenly call self. But since each aggregate is impermanent, conditioned, and constantly changing, there's no permanent self to be found. This is not nihilism, not a denial of existence. You exist conventionally as a process, as a pattern of physical and mental phenomena that maintains a certain continuity through time. But you don't exist ultimately as a permanent, independent, unchanging entity. Now we arrive at the crucial question: if there's no permanent self, what is it that gets reborn? This is where Buddhist philosophy demonstrates its profound sophistication. The answer is that there's a causal continuity without identity. Let me explain with a classic Buddhist metaphor. Imagine a candle flame burning. You can use that flame to light a second candle. The flame on the second candle is causally connected to the first flame, but is it the same flame? Not exactly. It's not completely different from the first flame, because without the first flame, the second flame wouldn't exist. But it's also not identical to the first flame because it's burning different wax, has a different shape, and exists in a different location. Buddhist philosophy describes this relationship as neither the same nor different, but causally connected. This is precisely the relationship between one life and the next. When a person dies, consciousness doesn't cease entirely, and it doesn't continue entirely. What happens instead is that the karmic momentum, the energy of all the actions, intentions, and mental habits accumulated during life, propels a new consciousness to arise. This new consciousness is not the same person reborn, but it's not a completely different person either. It's a continuation of the causal stream, like the second flame is a continuation of the first flame. This process is called pratityasamutpada, often translated as dependent origination or interdependent arising. It's the fundamental principle that all phenomena arise in dependence on causes and conditions, exist as long as those conditions persist, and cease when the conditions change. The Buddha described this process of rebirth through the 12 links of dependent origination, a detailed analysis of how suffering and rebirth perpetuate. The cycle begins with ignorance, specifically ignorance of the true nature of reality, ignorance of anatman. Because of this ignorance, karmic formations arise, actions of body, speech, and mind motivated by craving, aversion, or delusion. These karmic formations condition consciousness, which in Buddhism refers not just to awareness but to the ongoing stream of knowing that connects moments of experience. This consciousness, carrying karmic imprints, connects with name and form, the mental and physical aspects of a new being. This connection develops the 6 sense bases: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind. When sense bases contact sense objects, contact occurs. Contact gives rise to feeling, which triggers craving. Craving leads to clinging or grasping. Grasping conditions becoming, the process of taking birth. Becoming leads to birth, and birth inevitably leads to aging, death, sorrow, and suffering. The entire cycle is held together by ignorance of anatman. Recognize anatman, and the whole structure of compulsive rebirth begins to dissolve. This teaching reveals something profound about karma that's often misunderstood in popular presentations. Karma is not a cosmic system of reward and punishment administered by a divine judge. Karma is simply the law of cause and effect operating in the moral dimension. Actions have consequences. Intentional actions create tendencies, habits, and karmic momentum that shape future experiences. But there's no entity accumulating karma. There's just the process itself. Action conditions habit. Habit conditions character. Character conditions action. It's a feedback loop, a self-perpetuating cycle that continues until wisdom breaks the chain. You might be thinking, isn't this just philosophical abstraction? Does it really matter whether we call it reincarnation or rebirth? The distinction might seem subtle, but it has profound practical implications for spiritual practice and for how you relate to your life right now. The belief in a permanent self, even a reincarnating self, creates a subtle form of grasping that perpetuates suffering. If you believe you have an eternal soul, you inevitably cling to that soul as your ultimate identity. You become invested in protecting it, purifying it, ensuring its progress through lifetimes. This creates a dualistic relationship. You as the subject trying to manage your spiritual development as an object. Buddhist practice works completely differently. Since there's no permanent self to protect or perfect, practice becomes about releasing rather than acquiring. Instead of trying to purify your eternal soul, you're investigating the actual nature of experience and discovering that the self you've been protecting doesn't exist in the way you imagined. This discovery is liberating in the most literal sense. You've been guarding a treasure that was never real, fighting a battle that never needed to be fought. The relief of discovering this is described in Buddhist texts as like putting down a heavy burden you've been carrying for lifetimes. Share your thoughts in the comments. How does understanding no self change your perspective on spiritual practice? Consider how this affects your relationship to suffering. If you believe you have a permanent self that experiences suffering, you tend to personalize suffering in a particular way. This is happening to me. Why is the universe doing this to me? What did I do in a past life to deserve this? These questions reinforce the sense of a separate self to whom things happen. But when you understand anatman, suffering is still experienced, but the personalization begins to dissolve. Suffering arises due to causes and conditions. It's not personal, not punishment, not evidence of cosmic injustice. It's simply the natural consequence of impermanence and clinging. This understanding doesn't eliminate physical or emotional pain, but it dramatically reduces the additional suffering created by resistance, resentment, and the narrative of victimhood. The teaching also affects how you understand ethical responsibility. Some people worry that if there's no permanent self, then there's no one responsible for actions and no one to experience karmic consequences. This would seem to undermine ethical motivation, but this misunderstands the Buddhist position. Conventionally, persons exist and are responsible for their actions. The person who commits harm experiences the consequences. But ultimately, when you look carefully, you find processes rather than permanent entities. Both truths are valid at their respective levels of analysis. Denying conventional responsibility because of ultimate emptiness is what Buddhist philosophy calls nihilism, one of the two extreme views the Buddha warned against. The other extreme view is eternalism, the belief in permanent existence, which includes belief in a permanent self. The Buddhist middle way acknowledges conventional reality, while recognizing its ultimate emptiness. Now we need to address what seems like a massive contradiction. Tibetan Buddhism has an entire system for recognizing tulkus, reincarnated lamas. The Dalai Lama himself is considered the 14th incarnation of a lineage of spiritual leaders. Doesn't this prove that Tibetan Buddhism actually does teach reincarnation? This is where we need to understand the sophisticated view that Tibetan Buddhism applies to this practice. Tulku recognition is not based on the idea that an eternal soul transmigrates from one body to another. Instead, it's based on the principle that highly realized beings can consciously direct their rebirth through the power of intention and bodhicitta, the altruistic intention to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all beings. According to Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, most beings experience death in a state of confusion and are reborn according to karmic momentum without conscious choice. But a bodhisattva who has achieved high levels of realization can maintain awareness through the death process and intentionally choose circumstances of rebirth that allow them to continue benefiting others. This is possible not because they have a permanent self, but precisely because they've realized the emptiness of self. Having recognized that the self is a construction rather than an ultimate reality, they're less constrained by the habitual patterns that bind ordinary beings. They can consciously direct the causal stream that connects one life to the next. When a high lama dies, students and colleagues sometimes receive visions, dreams, or other indications about where the consciousness stream has taken rebirth. Teams of monks then search for children who show signs of being the continuation of their teacher's consciousness stream. Recognition of objects from the previous life, specific behaviors or knowledge they couldn't have acquired normally, and verification through various traditional tests. When such a child is identified and confirmed as a tulku, they're given intensive training to reawaken the spiritual knowledge and capabilities developed in previous lives. But notice the language here. They're described as the continuation of the teacher's consciousness stream, not as the teacher himself reborn. The child is neither exactly the same person as the deceased lama, nor completely different. They're a causal continuation, like the second flame lit from the first. This practice can create confusion for Westerners because it superficially resembles reincarnation, and tulkus themselves sometimes use language like, "I remember when I was Dalai Lama number 7. But this is conventional speech for practical purposes. At the ultimate level of analysis, there's no permanent I that was Dalai Lama number 7 and is now Dalai Lama number 14. There's a consciousness stream, a causal continuity shaped by specific intentions and spiritual development, manifesting in successive forms. The practice of recognizing tulkus acknowledges the continuity while not reifying a permanent self that continues. To fully understand why Buddhism rejects reincarnation, we need to explore the teaching of emptiness or shunyata, which is intimately connected to anatman. Emptiness doesn't mean nothingness or non-existence. It means empty of inherent existence, empty of independent self-nature. Everything exists, but nothing exists the way we ordinarily think it does. We perceive objects and persons as having independent inherent existence, as if their identity were built into them from their own side. But careful analysis reveals that everything exists only in dependence on other things, causes, conditions, parts, and conceptual designations. Take a simple object like a chair. Where is the chairness located? Is it in the legs? But the legs alone aren't a chair. Is it in the seat? But the seat alone isn't a chair. Is it in all the parts taken together? But when you disassemble a chair into its component parts, you have wood and screws and fabric, but no chair. The chair exists only when parts are arranged in a particular relationship and a mind designates that arrangement as chair. This doesn't mean chairs don't exist. It means they exist dependently rather than independently. They're empty of inherent existence while existing conventionally. The same analysis applies to persons. When you search for yourself, you can't find anything that is the self. Your body isn't you because it changes and will eventually die while something seems to continue. Your thoughts aren't you because they come and go and you can observe them. Your emotions aren't you because they fluctuate based on conditions. Your consciousness isn't you because it depends on sense organs and objects and changes moment by moment. Yet there is a conventional person, a pattern of physical and mental processes that we refer to with a name, and that can enter into relationships, make plans, and accumulate karma. This conventional person is empty of inherent existence while existing in a dependent, relational way. Nagarjuna, the 2nd century Indian Buddhist philosopher who founded the Madhyamaka school of Buddhist philosophy, systematized this teaching of emptiness in his foundational text, the Mula Madhyama Kakarika, or Fundamental Verses on the Middle Way. Nagarjuna demonstrated through rigorous logical analysis that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they arise dependently. His most famous verse states, "Whatever arises dependently is explained to be emptiness. That is dependent designation, and it is precisely the middle path." This verse equates 3 crucial concepts: dependent arising, emptiness, and the middle way between the extremes of existence and non-existence. For Nagarjuna, the teaching of anatman isn't just that persons lack inherent existence. All phenomena whatsoever are empty of inherent existence. There are no permanent essences anywhere. Everything is process, relationship, and interdependence. This is the ultimate truth that contrasts with conventional truth. Conventionally, chairs and persons and nations and mountains exist. Ultimately, they're all empty of the inherent existence we project onto them. Both levels of truth are valid and necessary. Ultimate truth without conventional truth leads to nihilism. Conventional truth without ultimate truth leads to eternalism and reification. This teaching of emptiness is what makes Buddhist rebirth fundamentally different from reincarnation. Reincarnation requires something permanent to reincarnate. Buddhism teaches that nothing whatsoever is permanent or has inherent existence. What we call rebirth is simply the continuation of dependent arising across the boundary of death. The karmic imprints and consciousness that seem to continue are themselves empty of inherent existence, arising moment by moment in dependence on causes and conditions. Understanding anatman intellectually is valuable, but it's not the same as realizing it directly. The Buddha didn't teach no-self as a philosophical doctrine to be believed. He taught it as something to be directly experienced through meditation practice. This is where Buddhist philosophy reveals itself as fundamentally empirical rather than speculative. You're invited to investigate your own experience to verify whether a permanent self can be found. In vipassana or insight meditation, practitioners systematically observe the arising and passing of physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts. As you sit in meditation, you notice that experience is made up of discrete momentary events, rather than being a continuous flow. A sensation arises in the knee, exists for a moment, and passes away. A thought about dinner arises, exists for a moment, and disappears. A sound comes and goes, nothing stays. Everything is in flux. At first you might think there's a stable self observing these changing phenomena, a witness that remains constant while experiences come and go. But as practice deepens, you notice that even the observer is a process, a series of knowing moments rather than a permanent knower. This can be disorienting at first. If there's no solid self, what holds experience together? How does continuity happen? The answer is that continuity is maintained by memory, habit, and karmic momentum, not by a permanent entity. Each moment of consciousness remembers the previous moment, creating a sense of continuous identity. But this is a construction rather than an inherent reality. It's like a movie, which appears to show continuous motion, but actually consists of discrete still frames presented in rapid succession. The continuity is apparent rather than real. As insight into anatman deepens, something remarkable happens. The anxiety and dissatisfaction that pervade ordinary life begin to ease. You realize you've been defending and promoting a self that doesn't exist in the way you imagined. This realization brings relief. You no longer need to protect your image, prove your worth, or ensure your permanence. These projects were based on a fundamental misunderstanding. You can act, relate, work, and live fully while knowing that the separate self you took yourself to be is a construction. This doesn't make you passive or indifferent. Released from self-obsession, you often become more genuinely compassionate and responsive to others because the barrier of self-preoccupation has thinned. If these teachings are opening new understanding for you, please share this video with someone else who would benefit from this wisdom. The mechanics of how karma works without a permanent self deserves closer examination, because this is where many people get confused. If there's no permanent self, who experiences the results of karma? If I do something harmful in this life, why should a different person in a future life experience the consequences? Isn't that unjust? This objection assumes that karma operates by punishing or rewarding a persistent entity across lifetimes. But that's not the Buddhist understanding at all. Karma operates through conditioning and habit formation. When you perform an action with intention, you're not just doing something external. You're simultaneously shaping your mind, creating neural pathways, establishing patterns that will condition future actions. A single act of generosity creates a slight tendency toward generosity. Repeated acts of generosity create a strong habit of generosity. This habit becomes part of your character, your default way of responding to situations. It affects your experience immediately by creating more harmonious relationships, less guilt and anxiety, and more opportunities for positive interactions. It also creates karmic momentum that conditions future rebirths. When death occurs, the physical body dissolves, but the karmic imprints and habits don't simply vanish. They're encoded in the subtle aspects of consciousness, what Tibetan Buddhism calls the very subtle mind, or the subtle consciousness that carries karmic traces. This subtle consciousness, along with its karmic imprints, connects with a new physical form at conception. The new being isn't the same person reborn, but they inherit the karmic momentum of the previous consciousness stream. They have tendencies, predispositions, and a karmic trajectory shaped by previous actions. Think of it like a river flowing into the ocean, then evaporating, forming clouds, falling as rain on mountains and flowing as a new river. Is the second river the same as the first? Not exactly. It's in a different location, flowing through different terrain, carrying different sediment. But it's not completely unrelated either. The water molecules might be the same molecules, and the process is continuous. Buddhist rebirth is similar. There's continuity without identity, connection without sameness. Now we arrive at the ultimate point of the Buddhist teaching. The goal isn't better rebirths. It's not about accumulating enough good karma to be reborn in pleasant realms. The goal is to transcend the entire cycle of compulsive rebirth altogether. This is nirvana, often misunderstood as a place or state, but actually referring to the extinction of craving, aversion, and ignorance. When these root causes of suffering are extinguished, there's no more karmic momentum propelling rebirth. The process simply stops, not because a self achieves eternal life, but because the causes for rebirth have been eliminated. This is why the realization of an atman is so central. As long as you believe in and cling to a permanent self, you perpetuate the cycle. Every action motivated by self-concern creates karmic momentum. Every attempt to secure the self, please the self, protect the self, or improve the self reinforces the delusion that there's a self to secure, please, protect, or improve. It's like trying to capture your reflection in a mirror. The more effort you make, the more you reinforce the illusion that the reflection is something real that could be captured. When you realize anatman directly, not just intellectually but experientially, the game changes entirely. Actions still occur, but they're no longer motivated by self-grasping. Compassion arises spontaneously because the barrier of self-other has been seen through. When there's no reified self to protect, authentic care for others emerges naturally. This is the state of the arhat in Theravada Buddhism, or the bodhisattva in Mahayana Buddhism, one who acts in the world but is no longer bound by it, one who helps others while knowing that ultimately there is no one to help and no one doing the helping. The Tibetan tradition emphasizes that even the concepts of rebirth and karma are ultimately empty. They're conventional truths, useful for understanding how things work at a relative level, but not ultimate realities. At the deepest level of insight, there is no rebirth because there is no birth, no death, no coming, no going. There's just the spontaneous display of awareness, appearing as the diverse phenomena of experience while never departing from its essential emptiness. This is the realization of Dzogchen, the great perfection teaching of Tibetan Buddhism, where even the concepts of paths and stages are transcended in the direct recognition of primordial awareness that has never been bound and therefore never needs to be freed. How does understanding that you're not reincarnating affect how you live now? First, it makes this life more precious. If you believe you have infinite future lives to get it right, there's a subtle temptation to postpone genuine practice. You can tell yourself you'll really commit to spiritual development in a future lifetime when circumstances are more favorable. But when you understand that there's no permanent you that will be reborn, no guarantee that human birth with access to spiritual teachings will occur again, this life takes on urgency. The causal stream that appears as your current existence might continue, but not as you. This specific configuration of body, mind, relationships, and opportunities is impermanent and precious. Second, it transforms your relationship to spiritual practice. You're not trying to purify an eternal soul or accumulate spiritual merit for a permanent self. You're investigating the actual nature of experience, discovering what's true, and allowing that discovery to transform how you relate to life. The emphasis shifts from becoming someone better to recognizing what's already here beneath the overlay of concepts and compulsive reactions. Third, it affects how you understand responsibility and ethics. Your actions matter tremendously because they create consequences, shape character, and condition future experiences. But you're not eternally punished or rewarded. Karma is not cosmic justice administered by a divine authority. It's simply cause and effect, operating in the domain of intentional action. Harmful actions create suffering because that's their nature, not because someone decided they should. Beneficial actions create well-being because that's what they do. This understanding makes ethics more immediate and natural rather than rule-based or fear-driven. Fourth, it changes your relationship to death. Death is still a significant transition, still unknown in its details, still potentially challenging, but it's not an existential threat to your fundamental being, because your fundamental being was never the solid self you imagined. Death is the dissolution of a temporary configuration, the releasing of this particular appearance, and the continuation of a causal process. There's grief for what's lost, uncertainty about what comes next, but not the metaphysical terror of annihilation that haunts those who believe in a permanent self-facing ultimate non-existence. Buddhist philosophy is famous for its teaching of the middle way, and nowhere is this more important than in understanding rebirth without reincarnation. The middle way avoids two extremes: eternalism, the belief that something permanent exists, and nihilism, the belief that nothing exists or that death is annihilation with no continuity whatsoever. Both extremes are incorrect according to Buddhist analysis. Eternalism is wrong because nothing whatsoever has permanent, independent, inherent existence. Everything is impermanent, conditioned, and empty of self-nature. But nihilism is equally wrong because there is continuity, causality, and ongoing process. Actions do have consequences. Karma does operate. Rebirth does occur. The middle way recognizes continuity without identity, persistence without permanence, process without essence. This both-and rather than either-or thinking is characteristic of Buddhist philosophy, and can be challenging for Western minds trained in either-or logic. We want to know, does the person continue after death or not? The Buddhist answer is that this question is badly formed. It assumes that persons exist in a way that would make continuing or not continuing meaningful. But persons are processes, not things. Asking whether a process continues is like asking whether a river continues after it flows into the ocean. In one sense, yes. In another sense, no. And the question itself reveals a misunderstanding of what rivers are. The Buddha himself addressed this issue directly in several suttas, or discourses. When asked whether a realized being exists after death, doesn't exist after death, both exists, and doesn't exist, or neither exists nor doesn't exist, the Buddha refused to accept any of these options. All four possibilities assume a reified entity about whom such questions could be meaningful. The Buddha's silence, his refusal to answer these questions, was not evasion, but a teaching in itself. These questions don't apply because they're based on fundamental misunderstandings about the nature of existence. We've explored one of the most profound and distinctive teachings in all of Buddhism, that there is no permanent self, and therefore no reincarnation in the conventional sense. What continues is a causal process, a stream of consciousness carrying karmic imprints, not an eternal soul-changing bodies. This teaching emerged as the Buddha's direct challenge to the Vedic doctrine of atman, the eternal self identical with the universal Brahman. By teaching anatman, no self, the Buddha established a spiritual path based not on union with an eternal reality, but on the direct recognition that no eternal reality exists to unite with. This teaching has profound implications. It transforms spiritual practice from a project of self-improvement to a process of self-investigation and discovery. It changes death from an existential threat to a transition within an ongoing process. It makes ethics immediate and natural, rather than rule-based or fear-driven. It invites you to look carefully at your actual experience, rather than accepting philosophical or religious doctrines uncritically. And it offers the possibility of liberation, not through achieving immortality, but through releasing the very grasping for permanence that creates suffering in the first place. The recognition of anatman is not pessimistic or nihilistic. It's profoundly liberating. When you discover that the separate, isolated, vulnerable self you've been protecting your entire life doesn't exist in the way you thought, an enormous burden lifts. You can stop defending something that was never real. You can stop trying to make permanent what is inherently impermanent. You can relax into the flow of experience, participating fully in life while knowing that the boundaries between self and other, between this and that, are conceptual constructs rather than ultimate truths. This moment right now is your opportunity to investigate this teaching directly. Don't accept it because an ancient text says it or because this video explains it logically. Investigate your own experience. Can you find a permanent self? When you look for yourself, what do you actually discover? Is there a solid, unchanging experiencer behind your experiences, or just the experiences themselves arising and passing? Is there a thinker separate from thoughts, or just thinking happening? Is there a seer separate from seeing, or just seeing occurring? These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're invitations to direct investigation that can transform your entire relationship to existence. What has been your experience of investigating the self? Have you found something permanent, or have you noticed the fluid, changing nature of all experience? Share your insights and questions in the comments below. This teaching becomes real only through your own investigation and discovery. If this exploration has challenged your assumptions about identity and existence, subscribe to this channel for more in-depth teachings from Tibetan Buddhist philosophy. And please share this video with anyone who would benefit from understanding the profound difference between reincarnation and rebirth, between the belief in an eternal soul and the recognition of no self. The Buddha's teaching on anatman remains as radical and relevant today as it was 25 centuries ago. In a world obsessed with self-promotion, self-protection, and self-realization, Buddhism offers a genuinely revolutionary alternative, investigating the self until you discover its ultimate emptiness, then living from that recognition with wisdom and compassion. You're not reincarnating because there's no permanent you to reincarnate, but there is a causal stream, a process of becoming that continues based on actions and intentions. Understanding this distinction isn't just philosophical knowledge. It's the key to liberation itself. May this teaching guide your investigation, and may you discover directly what the Buddha discovered, that the end of self-grasping is the beginning of genuine freedom.